Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night.
I become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms.
And the autumn moon is bright.
These words written by Kirk Siedlmak would be forever immortalized in the 1941 classic, The Wolfman. I was originally going to make this video focusing on just one movie, but instead of just one movie, I decided on it to be a character study of Larry Talbot on his journey throughout these movies, how he changed in the 2010 version, and how the times in which these movies were made were a glimpse into an Americanized Greek tragedy. In the 1941 movie, it's about a man named Larry Talbot who returns to his home in Europe after spending years away in America. Although he is saddened by the death of his brother who has recently died, everything seems good for Larry. He is a wealthy man who is romancing a woman and has a very positive outlook on life, until the fateful night that he is attacked and bitten by a werewolf. Now cursed with being a werewolf himself, Larry desperately seeks help, but no one believes him. Larry's situation of feeling helpless, while also being surrounded by death wherever he goes, is something that eerily resembled what was going on during that decade in which this movie was made, and it connected to the writer on a personal level. Kirk Siedlmak, who wrote the movie, was originally a movie writer in Germany, but with the rise of the Nazi Party, he no longer felt welcome, mainly for the fact that he was Jewish. When he was assigned the job to write the script for The Wolfman by Universal, he decided to have some of the story relate to his own personal life struggles that millions of people in Europe were facing. There are various forms of symbolism throughout the movie itself. The most noticeable out of all of them is the sign of the pentagram, in which marks the next victim for a werewolf. This was in contrast to the real-life horror for Jews under the occupation of Nazi Germany were forced to wear the Star of David. In a nutshell, both were marked for death by animals. Even later in the movie, when Larry's love interest is marked for death by the sign of the pentagram, taps into another connection with the persecution of Jews. Gwen lives upstairs in a building that happens to be in which she works with her father. This was symbolic of how many Jewish families lived where they had their businesses, but were vandalized as one of the early signs of animosity that they had received under the rule of Nazi Germany. With Larry himself, he tries to tell his father and others of the struggle, but no one believes him. This was similar to how many countries at the time underestimated the sinister plans that the Nazis had against the Jews, but were not convinced of this until it was too late. Even when Larry finds someone who does believe him, she tells him to wear a necklace for protection from the curse of the werewolf, but Larry refuses to wear it and becomes one himself. This can be seen in how many people of the Jewish faith believe that if they do not keep their contract with God and stray from the holy path, then they will not be protected from any bad things that might happen to them. Some Jewish people believe that this was the case for why they were being persecuted, but one thing was for certain. The enemy was the fascist Nazi Party, and the equivalent of that in this movie was that of werewolfism. This is not a stretch by any sort. The head of the Nazi Party had a fondness for wolves. In his book Fear Itself, Horror on Screen and in Reality During the Depression and World War II, Melvin E. Matthews quotes historian Robert G. L. Waite on why Adolf Hitler loved wolves so much. As a boy, he was well pleased with his first name, noting that it came from the Old German Athelwolf, a compound of Athel, noble, and Wolfa, wolf. Hitler's love for wolves was so immense that he even named at least several military bases with wolf names. The writer of the movie saw the main character as a generalization of the German people who may have been good people at heart, but became monsters when they were infected with the wolf-like Nazi Party. At the crescendo of this movie, Larry is killed, but being so would not free him from his Greek-like tragic existence, since he would be resurrected due to box office demand. In his autobiography Wolfman's Maker, memoir of a Hollywood writer, Kirk Siodmak revealed the secret to the success to his character of Larry Talbot. "I had, by chance, constructed the film like a Greek tragedy, which seemed to have made that character a classic. This would be so for Larry since he would be brought back to life in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, in which the rays of the full moon brings him back to life. He runs into the Frankenstein monster, and they are both in a desperate search for their own MacGuffins. While the monster wants to live, Larry wishes to be dead." A standout moment that showcases Larry's torment is when he attends a festival with a descendant of Dr. Frankenstein, and the lyrics by the singer strikes a nerve that hurts him to his very core.
For life is short, but death is long.
Stop that! Stop it! Quit that singing, will you? I don't want to live eternally. Why did you say that to me? Get away from me! Stay away! Go away, all of you!
This could also be seen in how Hollywood was turning out many upbeat and escapism movies during that time, but many could not forget about the horrors of real life. In the movie's climax, the two monsters battle it out. Through a contemporary lens of that time, this could be seen as art mimicking life, since it was around that time when two monstrous forces who were allies had turned against each other. If the Wolfman represented the wolf-like Nazi Germans, then the Frankenstein monster using his brute strength and size was the embodiment of the Soviet Union. In the next movie, House of Frankenstein, Larry meets a scientist named Dr. Niemann. This man promises to help Larry with freeing him of his suffering, but also saying the same to his assistant, who is a deformed hunchback. This is all a ruse since Dr. Niemann is lying his way to manipulate others for his scheme for revenge. Dr. Niemann promising to help those in need, but using them as a means to an end could be seen in the then president of the time, Franklin D. Roosevelt. It has been argued that Roosevelt's policies prolonged the years of the Great Depression, and they were more like bribes to keep himself in power. In his book Down and Out in the Great Depression, Letters from the Forgotten Man, Robert S. McElveen shows a ton of letters from people at the time period that saw through this, and of how many Americans were being tricked to re-elect someone just on the basis of free stuff. In the next movie, House of Dracula, Larry finds another doctor. He tells him that his condition is pressure on his head. While this revelation has divided fans on this movie, it did reflect in the changing times when science was starting to be seen in a more positive light than in a negative one. This progressive attitude is also seen in the movie casting a beautiful woman as a deformed hunchback, who is the moral center of the entire movie.
Think what you're doing, Doctor. To bring him back again, Doctor, would unleash worse than murder upon humanity.
That helpless body is man's responsibility.
Man's responsibility is to his fellow man.
Towards the end of the movie, Larry is given an operation and is finally freed of the curse. The year in which this movie was made coincided with the fact that World War II was over, and like how Nazism was freed from the world, so was Larry of being a werewolf. In the final scene of the movie, when the doctor becomes a monster himself, Larry kills him in an act of mercy. It really does rhyme with the first movie where Larry killed someone who may have been a monster, but was a tormented man with emotions and was ashamed of the monster that he was. Although Larry would turn into a werewolf again years later in the comedy Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, it is easy to ignore that movie in terms of continuity and to be happy for Larry to finally be happy with his life. More than 50 years after Lon Chaney Jr. had played his most iconic character of all time, Universal decided to remake that classic for 2010. In similar fashion to how different the 1999 remake of The Mummy was to the original from more than 50 years prior, it was inevitable that this remake would also make some drastic changes. The obvious ones of it being a period piece taking place in England during the late 1800s, as well as it being excessive and violent scenes involving the Wolfman killing, but another noticeable one in terms of characters would be the betrayal of Larry Talbot, now played by Benicio del Toro, and of his father John Talbot, who is now played by Anthony Hopkins. Unlike the father and son bond in the original movie where the father figure was supportive of his son to an extent, there is clear tension between these two. This is done deliberately in terms of their occupations and interests. Larry lives in a big city, John lives in the countryside. Larry is an actor, and John likes to hunt. Larry is not a fan of guns, but John is very trigger happy. Even back in 2010, this movie was trying to reflect in the current time in American history of the divide of various sides in America. One artistic form of symbolism that is simple but effective is the use of fire. When Larry and his father talk about the death of his mother, John lies about her death while blowing out a candle. It is revealed later in the movie that he is a werewolf and killed Larry's mother. In the climax of the movie, the home burns down, and as the Wolfman, he launches his father into the fireplace to show how he has been consumed by the lies that he spun for far too long. This clashing of father and son taps into what Sigmund Freud describes in his book The Wolfman, where he basically suggested that a man's relationship with his father was the source of his anxieties. This makes sense since the remake's title was changed to be spelled in the same way as Freud's book. In addition, in the book The Wolfman by the Wolfman, Ruth Mack Brunswick built upon what Freud had concluded by saying that, for him the wolf had always been the father, and here the wolves, all the fathers or the doctors, are trying to get at him to destroy him. This is not a coincidence since John sends his son to a mental institution in which he is tortured mercilessly by the staff there, in which it triggers a vision of his greatest fears and desires. Even though the legends of werewolves have dated back for thousands of years, and some very good werewolf movies have graced the silver screen for quite some time, there is great reason to why the Wolfman is still at the top of werewolf movies. It has a compelling character that audiences can connect with. Even though many iconic monsters by Universal have been played by multiple actors in their heyday, the Wolfman being played by only Lon Chaney Jr. was a big reason to why audiences could connect with him. In similar fashion to how it's hard to see another actor aside from Robert Downey Jr. playing Iron Man, or another actor aside from Hugh Jackman playing Wolverine, these movies were ahead of their time by constantly keeping the same actor playing such a three-dimensional character. Whether it be the violent and mentally damaged version of the character, or the iconic classic, Larry Talbot is someone who has reflected on the years in which he was living in. His struggle is so timeless that it has become a staple in werewolf movies for many years down the road. Kirk Siedlmack did contribute to the legend of the werewolf by adding silver as a weakness, and so on, with many customs from foreign countries being Americanized. It is safe to say that the Wolfman is a perfect example of an Americanized Greek tragedy.
The way you walked was thorny, through no fault of your own. But as the rain enters the soil, the river enters the sea. So tears run to a predestined end. Your suffering is over. Now you will find peace for eternity.